injunction, or rather the stay of the injunction from the Supreme Court, which was more than a technical ruling about standing of the plaintiffs or balancing government action and public rights. It was truly a betrayal of the Constitution's most basic promise that every person is judged by their actions and not by their appearance. The court said that ICE and the federal law enforcement are allowed to enforce immigration laws, and that it is permissible that stops are based on the following factors: presence at particular locations, such as bus stops, car washes, day laborer pickup sites, agricultural sites, and the like. The next factor was the type of work one does, which has never been illegal if it's work. 3, speaking Spanish or speaking English with an accent, which itself is not a crime. And 4, apparent race and ethnicity. I ask, if none of those things is in itself enough to form a reasonable suspicion to stop a person, how can the 4 of them added up equal a reasonable suspicion to believe that someone has no status to be in the United States? By allowing the Trump administration to treat apparent ethnicity, language, and low-wage labor as factors in detaining people, they have approved legalized profiling. This is not liberty. This is a return to suspicion by stereotype. And the Fourth Amendment, which declares that no person shall be subject to unreasonable searches and seizures, can now be read to say it's reasonable to profile based on appearance if the person who looks wrong happens to be near a low-wage workplace in a city with a large Latino population. 6 justices signed off, and 5 said nothing at all, simply letting the government continue. But Justice Kavanaugh at least put some reasoning on the paper, and it has all the justification and logic we should come to expect from a man who bragged about drinking beer with his friends Bart and Squee. The court emphasized in prior cases that particularized and objective suspicion is what is important in stopping a person with reasonable suspicion, not vague generalizations about who might be undocumented. But of course, Justice Kavanaugh twists this. He calls it common sense, literally common sense, to treat Mexican-looking men at a Home Depot as suspect, rebranding the stereotypes as circumstances. He suggests that Latinos as a group are statistically more likely to be undocumented, so appearance plus setting equals suspicion. I refuse to accept that that's what the Constitution says or what the American people believe. That is probability tables masquerading as constitutional reasoning, and the Fourth Amendment requires individualized suspicion. But instead, Justice Kavanaugh, speaking through a concurrence, replaced it with statistical discrimination. Of course, Justice Sotomayor sees it for what it was. Her dissent was twice as long as Kavanaugh's opinion, warns that this effectively licenses ICE to seize anyone who looks Latino, speaks Spanish, and appears at a low-working job. And she's right. What Kavanaugh calls common sense is the very stereotype the court has rejected in every other constitutional context. And I implore everyone to read Kavanaugh's 10 pages, which seem innocuous, maybe a bit backwards, and then read Sotomayor's 20 pages, which shows you the scam that the court is running on all of us. Because for decades, the Supreme Court condemned stereotypes as a basis for government action. Across many cases, the court wove a common thread, that stereotypes are poison to equal justice. But yesterday, Kavanaugh just shrugged it off. In prior cases, they've said women cannot be denied spousal benefits because of the stereotype that was from the 1975 case that women are usually dependent. The Supreme Court said in 1975 we can't use that stereotype. But yesterday they said Latinos can be detained because Latinos are often undocumented. Both of those are the worst forms of stereotypes. They don't even have the semblance of truth or statistical backing. They just betray the promise of equal justice. And here's another issue. The Spanish colonized the entire world, from the Philippines and Asia to Mexico, all the way to the tip of Chile and Argentina, to the Caribbean, Equatorial Guinea in Africa, and Florida in the United States. Latinos come in all colors. Some were immigrants and some were slaves. To Mexico and Central America, which is the apparent ethnicity that is specifically listed by Justice Kavanaugh. I don't know if I should be happy that Kavanaugh simply listed only Mexico and Central America and left other geographies out, or if I should be worried that he didn't explicitly rule out where other Latino-looking immigrants come from. Now, this is not abstract. This means that Mexican-American citizens, those born in San Diego, may feel compelled to carry a passport to the grocery store, or a Puerto Rican grandmother, who Puerto Ricans having citizenship since 1917, before or during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, might have to tuck her birth certificate into her purse when she goes out. It means an 8th-generation Californian whose family lived in Los Angeles when it was still El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora, la Reina de los Ángeles, in 1781, decades before Brett Kavanaugh's ancestors arrived from Ireland, have to wonder, is today the day I end up in handcuffs for leaving my house without some form of ID? Now, federal law requires immigrants to carry documents. That's in the United States Code. But citizens are not required to carry proof of citizenship. The Fourth Amendment protects that freedom. The Fourth Amendment, which was gutted yesterday. So what happens when a citizen says to an ICE officer, I don't have to carry documents, I'm an American? Does that officer let them walk away, acknowledging that right? Or does the appearance-based suspicion, which was ratified yesterday, override the assertion of the right to freely move? The court has left every citizen who got tan this summer and walks past a place where an immigrant works in that limbo. Now let's ask something more. Why is this policy being defended so fiercely by the Trump administration? Well, let's follow the money on that one. By many estimates, 85 to 90% of detained immigrants are being held in private prisons. GEO Group and Core Civic donate heavily to political campaigns. GEO gave $1 million to Trump's main super PAC. Core Civic sent hundreds of thousands to the RNC and affiliated committees. Proportionately, 98% of private prison donations went to red candidates and support for them, and 2% went to blue candidates. These companies charge, on average, $115 per detainee per day. That amount would help almost every San Diegan afford rent in San Diego. And every 1,000 immigrants detained for 2 weeks recoups the $1 million campaign donation. Our tax dollars are being siphoned into corporate prison profits, and the Supreme Court just made it easier for that pipeline to flow. As the Buffalo Springfield song said, there's something happening here. The difference between now and then is that it's exactly clear what's going down. Now, let's bring this back to everyday life. This morning, I stood in line at a Wells Fargo bank on El Cajon Boulevard, and the first 8 people in that line at 8:57 a.m. were Latino, including me. Across the street, a construction crew was at work. Next to me stood a man with a thick brown and gray mustache. Now, he was working on that construction site. I'm an Ivy League law graduate, like most of the justices who yesterday decided I should be detained if I don't look like I'm in the right place. That guy was that construction worker. And under this decision, if we walk across the street together, our appearance could trigger suspicion to stop us. I have to ask the justices who think this is okay, how dusty do my pants need to be before I look like an undocumented laborer? What if I switch from dress shoes to work boots? What if my Spanglish is good enough to sound fluent? What if I drive an F-150 that might be more affordable than the F-250? At what point does culture, language, or style become reasonable suspicion in the eyes of 6 justices? When I'm 10 feet from that construction zone? 5 feet? 1 foot? No group of Americans should have to live this way, and the Constitution has until yesterday interpreted support of my notion. So if you look Latino, which means you could be Middle Eastern, a dark-haired Frenchman, an Arab, an Italian who just had a long week at the beach for vacation, a Sephardic or Mizrahi Jew, a Native American, or anyone else with a bit of tan and brown hair, the Supreme Court said yesterday, you really ought to carry your passport or your birth certificate or ID. Because if you do, Justice Kavanaugh said, that individual will be free after the brief encounter with law enforcement, except for those folks who got deported by accident to someplace they weren't born and can't get back here. That's not a brief encounter. The Supreme Court's decision ratifies the worldview that some people are suspicious by appearance alone. Dark hair, dark eyes, tan skin, sounds like you speak Spanish, or look like you might, you're less free than your neighbor. And I believe the Constitution demands better. If the Fourth Amendment stands for anything, it's that the government has to treat individuals by their conduct and not as stereotypes. And Justice Sotomayor defended that principle, and the majority abandoned it. But here's the truth. We cannot accept that this is now a republic of suspicion. We must insist that we are a republic of laws. And let me be very clear. I know I gave a personal story from this morning. I know this isn't about me. It's not about law enforcement. I'm a former member of law enforcement. I know very well what the difference between reasonable suspicion and probable cause, preponderance of the evidence, clear and convincing evidence, and proof beyond a reasonable doubt means. And I don't think anyone up here or have ever watched a city council meeting will ever deign to say, I don't support law enforcement. But over the last 3 years, right after right after right after right, the right wing of the Supreme Court has just said that one of their own that sits right next to them, Justice Sotomayor, don't show up in LA with jeans and a long sleeve white t-shirt next to a Home Depot, because otherwise, you know, common sense says she's an immigrant who ought to have her papers on her. That's not liberty. Liberty ought not be conditional, because citizenship doesn't come with that condition. The government, in all ways, must bear the burden of proof that something is wrong, that someone has done something wrong, and forcing U.S. citizens of Latino ancestry to carry proof that they can be here is foisting the government's burden back on them, and it's instilling fear in all of our neighborhoods. A government that labels criminals